At this place in history, we're in Hinesburg, Vermont. I'm joined by Executive Director of the Vermont Historical Society, Steve Perkins. Steve, what are we doing here?
Hey, good morning. So, like you said, we're in Hinesburg and we're looking at a really interesting piece of Vermont's history. There was a community that lived here in Hinesburg. African Americans, freed slaves, and from like 1795 all the way up through to the 1940s. So, what was their life like? How did they work with the people around them? What was this community and what did it mean to Vermont? That's what we're going to talk about today. So Amanda, we've called Elise Guyette, who wrote a wonderful book about this community and did a lot of research on that. So hopefully we can dig a little bit deeper into what this community meant. So, hi Elise.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing well. So tell us about this community. When did it start? Who were the first people who moved here? And if you can tell us why right here?
Well, those are all wonderful questions, of course. I find first the Clark family who moved up to the top of the hill. And then a few years later, the Peters family moved in and they were down here. And this was actually their property. All of this right here, they had 100 acres here and they had some on the other side as well.
Vermont often has a reputation of being very racially tolerant. What was it like for this community? Is that the case?
Well, I think the first people who came, they came right after the Revolution, and that was a period of, freedom and justice for all, and there were more enslaved peoples freed during that revolutionary era than until the Civil War. But unfortunately, after a while, I think the white world was not comfortable with the number of freed blacks that were around them, and they got uncomfortable about that. And when they're first here, they're very successful, and the Clarks at the top of the hill are successful right up until the Civil War, actually. But I see things happening to them later that shows that they were a part of the wider world, that Vermont was a part of the wider world, and started treating blacks differently.
So these were fairly well-off families, relatively speaking, because of the amount of the land they owned, and obviously they didn't sell. They were here for generations.
Right, they were here for generations. The Peters actually, they're still around in Hinesburg, and they've probably been here for a couple hundred years. The Clarks at the top were there for about 70 years. They ended up leaving right after the Civil War. But they sold their property and they bought property in other places. They bought property in South Burlington and in Williston, and they farmed there for the rest of their lives. They just did not farm up here on the hill. There is an abandoned cemetery. It was a family cemetery, and so when all the family moved away, there was no one there to take care of the cemetery. Unfortunately, we know where that is. We can still see a field stone standing there and some shards from the vandalized stones. There's a house up there that I believe was built and lived in by the second generation. There are signs here and there, cellar holes, stone walls, some houses still standing, which I didn't think that I was going to find, but that was exciting to find.
So you wrote a book on this topic, and as historians, we always look at the past, but we try to say, how do we connect that to our present and what's going on today? Are there takeaways from the research that you've done that you could link to today?
Well, the first takeaway for me is just the fact that this community existed and existed for such a long time, because Vermont really doesn't have a great track record in facing our history and in writing the history of people of color in this state. So that to me was just the most amazing thing right from the beginning, that there was a place like this here. And then secondly, just to see the ups and downs of these folks' lives, because that's what history is, ups and downs, and their lives followed that up and down.
In Hinesburg, Vermont, at this place in history.